All right, everybody, welcome to Process is No One, Hunting for Token Manipulation. My name is Jared Atkinson, and I'm the Adversary Detection Technical Lead at a cybersecurity startup called Kerberos. I do a lot of development in my spare time, so a couple things that I'm really interested in is PowerShell. So I'm a Microsoft MVP for my work in PowerShell. Digital forensics, I work on a project called Power Forensics, which allows you to do NTFS parsing from within PowerShell, and a couple other projects that we put together from PowerShell. My background is I got my start in the U.S. Air Force on the Hunt team there, and then I worked for Varus Group's Adaptive Threat Division before SpecterOps. And I'll let Robby introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Robby Winchester. I also work at SpecterOps. I work with Jared for the ACE tool we presented yesterday at Arsenal. Also worked on a Dockerized version of ELK. Used to be Air Force as well on the red side, and then transitioned over after I got out of the military to do more of the Hunt approach, which is going to be the focus of this conversation. And I also used to work at the Adaptive Threat Division. So what are we going to talk about today? Obviously, the title is about detecting the access token manipulation. But first, we're going to go into kind of a background of what is Hunt. It's kind of a buzzword a lot of times of different people mean different things. So we're going to identify first at the beginning what we consider to be Hunt, talk about how adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures are an important part of understanding what hunting is, and then how we do hypothesis-driven hunting, specifically then doing a case study for this of how to use this hypothesis process to go through and detect the access token manipulation in the environment. So we're going to start on our quest to understand the hunting. Next slide. So what is hunting? When we say hunting, we mean you're actively searching your environment for the presence of some malicious activity that your current in-place defenses have not detected. The assume breach mentality has kind of become more popular. Mark Krasinievich has talked about it at different conferences, among other people. And so the concept here is that a security breach is not something that may happen, it's something that will happen, it's just a matter of time. If you're a significant enough target, you're going to be targeted. It only takes that one chance for someone to gain that initial code execution. And so for some level of compromise or some type of malicious activity to occur in your network is a very likely event. What we're focusing on is that post-exploitation activity where after the code execution has occurred, how can we detect the adversary activity in the environment? Most of the traditional network defense appliances or defense appliances, such as like firewalls and antivirus, they're really focusing on stopping that initial execution. And so we want to look where a lot of times there is not effort, kind of inside the network, and focus on that other half. And that's what we're going to talk about during this brief. So what does a normal hunt cycle look like? So kind of the generic beginning level hunt process, a lot of times that we would see is kind of two-part, where you gather data and then you hunt for bad, and you're trying to find that APT in your environment. The problem with this, next slide, is kind of two-part. So when you're gathering data, it's not all data is equal, and not all data is really as useful. So what data should you be collecting, and why are you collecting that data? Is there a purpose behind gathering every event log or every process? If you're not actually performing any type of analytics on it, are you just bogging down and paying extra money to a provider, for say like Splunk, or loading up your SIM? And so there's a cost there of gathering the data. And then additionally, when you're hunting for bad, it's really difficult if you sit down in front of your SIM and have 1 million or 1 billion events and just try and look for something without a direction. And so a lot of times there's a focus that's very vague or very broad. And so you have to baseline your activity, you have to know what's good. And this is just a nuanced problem, and without kind of taking a bite-sized approach, it can easily become overwhelming. Additionally, as you have this data coming in, a lot of times you're going to have more data flowing in than you have time to look at it. So the amount of data to look at is growing faster than you're able to parse through it. So it just kind of becomes a big problem. So the new approach and what we prescribe to is the hypothesis-driven hunting. So rather than just gathering data and looking for something that's bad, the first step is you create this hunt hypothesis, which is what you're going to specifically look for. in the environment, and then you gather the data in support of that hypothesis. So there's a purpose behind it. You're choosing the things that you want so that you know you can use them, and they're going to help you in that targeted hunting for bad activity. So it's now not just an open-ended question. You're trying to solve iterative problems over time. So what are the benefits of this? Well, first, it's focused data collection. So you're not just having data come in and getting more and more events, more and more activity without a purpose. It's also going to give you a goal. So if you have a team, you can tell them a specific thing you're looking for, and that's going to let you have that focus and not have the analysis paralysis of this vague concept that is a little hard to quantify. Again, also, if you're tracking these, if you have a targeted focus, then over time, you can identify where you've been hunting, what you've been hunting for, and it's really helpful for trends, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. But basically, this hypothesis approach really helps to clarify a lot of things and make it a more focused effort that is actually causing improvement rather than just starting to hunt, which is just gathering data and not necessarily getting a tangible result. So next slide. So awesome. Hopefully everyone agrees hypothesis-driven hunting sounds like the way to go. How do you make a hypothesis, and what should a hunt hypothesis be? This is kind of the problem that we had that inspired us to start doing these briefings. There's very vague guidance, or people will talk about a hypothesis-driven hunt, but not really what that hypothesis should be, how you should make those, and it's kind of all over the board. So we really wanted to have a process internally where we could track it over time, have it be iterative, and work as consultants with clients to develop their programs. So we're going to walk you through our process here of how to kind of do that process in an iterative fashion that's going to really increase the sophistication, ideally, of your program. But before we get into that, we're going to cover a little bit of background. So slide. Everyone's familiar with some type of hacker methodology lifecycle. We're going to reference MITRE both from the cyber attack lifecycle and then attack matrix on the next slide. But in general, there's always some type of attack path that is going to take place from a recon all the way through kind of whatever your end goal, exploitation or exfiltration of data or achieving an effect. So like I said at the beginning, we're going to really focus on that kind of post-exploitation, control, execute, maintain. Next slide. And for us, the best reference we've found is the MITRE attack framework. If you haven't ever seen that, MITRE is a United States federal contractor that produces a lot of open information, the attack framework being kind of the most popular and our personal favorite. And so it's a huge body of knowledge that has a lot of different attack tactics, techniques, and procedures. Kind of correlates to the different things in the attack cycle, but really has a lot of that post-exploitation focus that we're hoping for. And it also addresses both Windows, Mac, and OS X. So that's something really helpful if you've never seen it. Slide. This is what it looks like. I do not expect you to read that. This is just to highlight there's a lot of stuff here. Everything on there is a hyperlink, so if you click it, you're going to get more information. So why is this important? Slide. So first, TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures. As we said in the introduction, we're both prior military. And so for us, TTPs have a very specific meaning. And so I'm going to kind of walk through what that means and why that's important, because we often see it misused. And I'm going to kind of use an analogy of taking care of your car to highlight what this means. So the tactics are from a United States joint publication, Military Doctrine, the employment and ordered arrangement of forces in relation to each other. So what does that mean? This is a real high-level general guidance. So when we're talking about, for example, owning a car, there's a lot of different things you'd want to do as part of that. And so like a high-level thing would be preventative maintenance. So that's not telling you exactly what to do, but it's a category of stuff that you want to take care of if you want to have a functioning car long-term. So if you go down to the next level, you have techniques, and that's the non-prescriptive ways or methods used to perform missions, functions, or tasks. So for the car analogy, if preventative maintenance is the high level, changing your oil would be an example of a technique. So we're not saying how to do it or how frequently, any of that type of information. It's just in general, for the majority of cars, you would want to change the oil. And so non-prescriptive, general method of making sure that your engine, your car is functioning well. And then finally, you get into procedures, which are the actual standard detailed steps of how to do something. So this is going to be in-app manufacturers for your specific car. If you have a BMW, you're going to do this. If you have a Toyota, you're going to do this. What types of oil to use, what types of filter. It's going to be those detailed steps. So all of that also applies to what we're talking about here today. And the MITRE attack matrix is a good way to break that down. So the tactics on that MITRE attack matrix are those column headers. So those are kind of those big buckets like persistence and credential access and discovery. The big buckets that are going to group things into those categories. It's going to be really useful for tracking your focus over time, areas where you have or do not have coverage. Those techniques, the non-prescriptive methods, those are going to be all of those entries in the actual column. Right now, there's about 220 different techniques that are represented in the attack matrix. And like I said, it's across both Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. So those are going to be those behavioral. It's not going to tell you how something is being done, but it is going to tell you, for example, like credential dumping is a technique that is used as part of the credential access tactic. And then finally, you have procedures. So now the procedures are going to be those detailed specific information. With relation to the MITRE attack matrix, if you click on one of those techniques, it's going to pull up into something like this, and it's going to have a lot of times examples. That's where you're going to be able to find those like threat intelligence feeds, technical write-ups about what's going on. This is going to be the actual kind of nitty-gritty. What tools were actually being used? What were the command lines being run? What were the specific things that they were doing in order to achieve the effect on the environment? Slide. So why is this useful? Well, it's important to understand all these different concepts because a lot of the kind of traditional focus, especially of threat intelligence, has been more at the procedure level on the hashes and looking for C2 IPs and kind of that blacklist approach. And the problem with that, as we've experienced, is those kind of are brittle indicators that are fairly easy for an attacker to change. And if that's changed, then you miss whatever that next iteration is, and you're fighting a losing battle. So with that in mind, we always recommend focusing on that technique and that more behavioral level. So you're able to focus on what is being done and what is the process that they're trying to achieve rather than how they're specifically doing it. With that in mind, you can reference the attack matrix throughout your hypothesis process, and we're going to be doing that shortly. Additionally, in your environment, if you don't have any type of model that you're representing of where you're collecting data, where you have coverage and where you don't, this is a really good example of you can map out where you currently have visibility with your standard in-place toolset, and then you can focus your hunt efforts and your additional effort in those areas where you don't have that current focus. So from a planning and focusing of resources perspective, it's really helpful. And then additionally, that's going to identify those areas where you don't currently have coverage. If say, for example, you realize in mapping things you don't have anything that's actually looking for the abuse of credential access, that's then maybe an area where you'd want to focus either a technology solution or a personnel effort to get coverage in that area. So we've covered the background. Now we're going to go on to the fun part, get into what is this process? How are we building the hunt hypothesis in order to investigate that? So we have a five-step process we're going to walk through. The intention here is that you make a very focused, actionable hunt hypothesis that you can investigate for specific behavior, specific attacker activity in your environment. And we intend that this is something that you would be creating these hypotheses that would be executed over a 1-week period of time. That's just going to allow for you to iteratively be solving these small problems and actually having an effect in your environment. A lot of times we have experienced where you'll start down a path and either get too far down a rabbit hole of research before trying to solve a problem, and then you are not actually taking it to completion, or it becomes an overwhelming problem of breadth, and so you're worried about every aspect of a certain attack, and so nothing gets accomplished. And so we're trying to combat that by really focusing things down and having a set of steps where you can walk through and get a tangible result. So the first part is identifying the tactic and technique. So back to the MITRE attack matrix, the tactics are those broad column headers. So this is that high level what you're going to look for. The initiating event, kind of the instigation for this, can come from any source really. It may be your CEO is worried about some type of attack. You are reading threat intelligence about other industry vertical type threats that are occurring, and you're worried about something occurring. If after say WannaCry, you're worried about ransomware. Those types of things can drive this, but the focus here is take that initial idea and refine it down to, for this hunt hypothesis, what is the tactic we want to look at, and then what is the technique beneath that. There's rarely, if ever, going to only be a single technique involved in an attack chain. Inherently, these attacks are chained together, and it's a series of different things occurring. And so we're trying to take advantage of that, where we don't need to find every evidence of activity. We just need to find something. And if we find something, then that can potentially unravel the whole chain. It's changing that dynamic to, instead of the defender's dilemma of always having to be right, you can switch it to the attacker dilemma, to where they have to be evading all of these really good in-place defenses. So at this point, you have a tactic and technique, and you're going to be focused on one specific thing you're looking for. However, for that technique, it's a non-prescriptive broad way, so there's going to be some nuances and some tools and specific things. So phase 2 is identifying the procedures. So these are that you're going to use those threat reports and look at tech write-ups, and you want to understand what are the tools that are being used, how are those tools being used, and not just what are they, but from a behavioral perspective, what is the objective? So, for example, it would be worth understanding Mimikatz is being used to dump credentials, but you need to understand more than just they're running Mimikatz. You should understand how they're leveraging the back-end internals of Windows to do that, because you can recompile or write your own version. So it's understanding what can and can't be easily changed across all of that. Are there similar behaviors, similar patterns? And this is going to require research to go through and understand. A lot of times, this is the biggest benefit is at the end of this, you will have had to spend that time in research to identify how this all works, and you're going to walk away with a really good understanding. So once we have the tactics, techniques, and then the procedures that are used, the next phase is really the bulk of the effort. And this is where you're going to want to take those tools, take that actual technical intelligence, and research it yourself, ideally in your own environment. So deploy the malware, deploy the behavior, emulate that behavior, and identify for yourself what those indicators are from a behavioral perspective. So we're not looking for hashes. We're looking for things that we can find that are going to be difficult to change and are going to be more consistent with the actual process. Additionally, where this is really helpful is you can baseline and set this for your environment. So we always recommend using a gold image type system, because that's going to help you know what is going to potentially be high false positives in your environment. And then at the end of this, you should have a POC basically of, hey, this is the data that we need to collect in order to detect these types of behaviors that we can then go take to the enterprise. So you have a very focused collection effort. Next slide. The next step is identifying the scope. So there's two factors, time and the number of data sources, because this may be network subnets rather than just endpoint hosts. And so we recommend a week for the time, just because it really puts a good constraint in the perspective of we want to focus our effort. And the number of data sources that you can collect is going to be really dependent upon your environment, what the data collection process and analysis entails, and what your permissions are. And you may find that your scope may be limited due to the collection capability. You may have problems with credentials. And so this is really leading into kind of the last point, which is the most important, is documenting everything up until that point that you've excluded. So this is what's going to really make this be a cycle rather than a one-off event. What things are you not able to do? So if you're looking at an APT report and you're focusing on one technique, what are the other techniques that were included that you put to the side? Those aren't forgotten forever. Those are just fodder for a next hypothesis. And so you can use this to identify if you have technical limitations that you're identifying over this process for collection. That's going to be really good to inform those technology purchases. So when a vendor comes and says, you should buy our tool, you can identify the areas where you need coverage, and they can identify then, oh, okay, you're covering things that I already have, or this is really meeting a requirement that I need. And it also can help for if you're constantly having things excluded from the scope for production systems, this can help quantify over time you have not been able to look at all these types of things on those production systems. So it can kind of help for leadership to understand what the scope limitations may be impacting. So At the end of this, what do we have? Well, you should have a specific behavior that you understand, that you know what the technique is, you have a better understanding because you spent the time digging into this one aspect of it, and then the knowledge of what data you need to collect specifically to detect that activity. And that's really where you would then transition over and perform that hunt after you've done this. Next slide. So what's the benefit of this? Like I said at the beginning, it really focuses, and at the end, you would have a specific targeted tactic, technique, and set of procedures, and you will be able to, at the end, say, yes, this was found or was not found in my environment. You can transfer those high confidence, low false positive alerts over to your SOC, and then use this to kind of iteratively bring your entire detection baseline forward. And the biggest thing that we like is if you have you have this all documented out and a new attack report comes out, a new APT. If you go and you match this up against, we're currently looking for this set of techniques. If you can map the techniques in the new reports that come out, you're going to already know areas where you're either vulnerable to missing detections or where you can potentially find them. Slide. So with that, that's the background process. Jared's now going to walk through an actual implementation of this for detecting access token manipulation.
Cool. Thank you, Robby. So we're going to, for the case study, we're going to use a notional company, which the situation that they're going to be kind of operating under is a conglomeration of all the different, some of the shortcomings that we've seen in security programs. And so the general idea to kick off this hypothesis is that our CISO went to DEF CON and Black Hat a couple of years ago and saw a presentation about PowerShell Empire, right? And so he saw PowerShell Empire, he came back and he said, hey guys, can we detect PowerShell Empire, right? And so when he asks that question, he's really kind of asking three things, right? So there's a couple implicit questions. One is, can we detect PowerShell Empire, whatever that means? Can we stop it? And are we currently affected by somebody using PowerShell Empire? To give you a background of kind of the situation of our notional company, we have a very small security budget, right? So that means we don't have these expensive tools on the endpoints. We don't have any like agent-based monitoring. We also have poor lateral network visibility. So we're not able to see that host-to-host communication going on. We can only see network traffic as it's exiting the network. And everybody in the company is a local administrator on their own machine, right? Everybody kind of, I saw some people giggle, but that's a real situation in lots of companies. So the reality is that the CISO's, he's focusing on Empire, right? Empire is just a tool. But what he really wants to know is, like, can we detect the capabilities that Empire is employing, right? And so if we go to the next slide, we're going to kind of break down the tactics and techniques that are built into Empire. And so for those that aren't familiar, Empire is a PowerShell remote access toolkit, and it employs pretty much the entire gamut of attack techniques. And so we ran out of slide space, but we generally listed out some of the tactics and techniques that it employs, and things like privilege escalation, right? So access token manipulation, bypassing user account control. There's a DLL injection component to it. It also has a Mimikatz component, so you could do credential dumping. You could pass the hash using Empire. You can also do things like golden and silver tickets, and you can laterally move via WMI, PSExec, all those types of common techniques. Now, as you probably assume from the title of the talk, we're going to just select access token manipulation as the single technique that we're going to look for, because if we look for all of this, we're just going to be in over our heads, right? That's too much for an individual to look at one time to try to detect. And so we're going to focus on one thing, and the reason why we focused on it is who here has done something like this, right? So, or seen this, right? So the very first command, like everybody's first interpreter command, is get system, right? And what get system does is it's going to steal the system token and apply it to your current process so that you can execute as if you're in the system user context, right? And so that is an example of access token manipulation, and because of that, that's something that we decided that we wanted to focus on. All right, so when we talk about the procedures, we have this general technique, access token manipulation, but we want to understand, like, how is access token manipulation actually executed? Are there different ways that an attacker can employ this technique? And so if we go to the next slide, we want a general understanding. And so we can go to that MITRE ATT&CK framework, and we can query, say, like, what is access token manipulation? And it will say, basically, Windows uses access tokens to determine the security context of a process or thread that's running on a system. However, there is this concept in Windows called token impersonation, or impersonation in general, that allows a process to apply a different user's security context at the thread level. And so basically a process can operate as a different user for certain contexts. And so attackers have found out that they can use this impersonation concept to basically operate as a different user to achieve some effect that they want. So in this case, if I'm an admin user, but I want to do something on behalf of the system or like the Windows root account, then I would be able to steal the system token and then kind of assume that identity. And so as we're going through, we have a lot of red teamers that work with us, and so we kind of talk through some of the different token techniques or procedures that they're using, and we kind of broken into three groups. So there's token impersonation or theft. This is that get system token kind of attack where you literally just steal a currently residing access token from a different process. Create a process with a token, which is you steal a token and then you create a brand new process with that token, and then make an impersonate token. This is where the token isn't readily available to you, but you have something like a username and password, and so you would then go ahead and create a token and then go ahead and steal that and impersonate it. So next slide. To understand how all of this works and maybe the type of information that we need to gather, we really need to understand how Windows authentication works in general, right? And so generally speaking, when a user sits at a computer and authenticates to that system, if it's a Windows operating system, it's going to instantiate a logon session. And these logon sessions are managed by the local security authority, or as most of us know, like the LSAS process, right? And so your credentials are going to be stored in lsas.exe, and that's why like Mimikatz works, right? It pulls those credentials from LSAS. And those credentials are used for single sign-on. So like when you try to access your network file shares, it's not going to prompt you for your username and password every time because you've already stored those inside of LSAS. And so when I say credentials, just for clarification, I don't just mean username and password. I mean things like NTLM hashes, Kerberos tickets, plain text passwords, so on and so forth. Now, every single process and thread is going to have an access token associated with it, and that access token is going to be related to the logon session, right? So I log on as the Jared user account, I create a logon session for that user, and then there's an access token which is going to be granted to every process that's spawned from that logon session. And so a general kind of flow here is you put in your credential, a logon session is created, which has an access token, which is then given to threads or processes that are created on that logon session's behalf. Next slide. All right, so generally speaking, when we're talking about access token manipulation, a lot of people kind of have like a misunderstanding of the difference between like delegation and impersonation tokens and network logons and non-network logons. And so we see a lot of guidance that says things like, oh, if you're an attacker, if you're trying to impersonate a token, make sure that it's a delegation token and not an impersonation token. And so we won't get into that right now, but that advice is incorrect. The thing that really matters is the type of logon. Remember, the credentials are stored in the logon session, not in the access token. So the type of access token doesn't necessarily matter. It's really how the logon session was created. And so generally speaking, if a logon session is of a network type, meaning something like WMI, WinRM, which is PowerShell remoting, then the actual credentials are not passed the remote system, and thus those credentials aren't available for credential dumping attacks or access token like token theft. On the other hand, if you do a non-network or interactive logon, something like console access, so sitting at the computer, or RDP, then you're actually passing your credentials to the remote system, you're passing that, creating a new access token, and thus an attacker can take advantage of that and steal that. So the implication here is that as a defender or an admin, you want to make sure that you're using those network logon types, so logon session type 3, whenever you're doing remote administration to be as secure as possible. All right, so I've mentioned access token a few times. What is an access token? Well, an access token is a data structure that's stored in the kernel, and it basically provides or describes the security context of a process or thread to which it's applied. The types of information that are inside of an access token are like the user account security identifier, or SID, the group SID, so what groups does this user belong to? Are they a domain admin? Are they a local administrator? So on and so forth. A list of privileges for the users and groups. So does this user have like SE debug privilege? Do they have the ability to shut down the computer? Can they perform impersonation? The token integrity level. So a lot of times attackers will talk about like bypass UAC, and the USC prompt that pops up and says, do you want to be an administrator? The integrity level is going to basically dictate whether that token has the ability to act on the behalf of an administrator. And then the impersonation level and a list of restricting SIDs. So let's say I have a administrator account, but I don't want to provide that access to the full access of that administrator account to a process. You can restrict some of its privileges and capabilities. Next slide. And then going back to kind of that delegation versus impersonation concept, there's two types of tokens. So there's primary tokens, and those are tokens that are applied at the process level. And then there's, so every process is going to have a primary token. And then there's what they call impersonation tokens, and these are tokens that are created via impersonation, that concept I talked about. And these are going to be applied at the thread level. So an impersonation token only dictates the security context of an individual thread, not an entire process. And then there's, within kind of the subcategory of impersonation, there's these 4 different impersonation levels. From the top is anonymous all the way down to delegation, and I'll let you kind of take a look at that. But generally from the top it's the most restrictive, and the bottom is the least restrictive. So delegation would allow that access token to pass its information to another system. Next slide. All right, so again, just a general overview. Every process has a primary token, and that describes, again, the security context of the user. By default, threads are going to inherit that primary token from the process, but you can do impersonation, which will give the thread a completely different user context. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about token impersonation, right? This is like the most common thing that you would ever come across. So if you've ever used Meterpreter or PowerShell Empire and you've done like steal token, that type of attack, this is what I'm talking about, right? So there's a user, let's say you fish into a system and you gain access running as, Bob, the guy in HR or something like that. Bob doesn't have a lot of privilege, but there's probably somebody, or like a system account being run somewhere. So like LSAS is running a system, when Logon, so on and so forth. And so if I want to become system, all I have to do is impersonate that access token, apply it to myself, and now everything I do from that thread's context is going to be running as the system account. To do this from the API level, you're going to use get a handle to that process using open process. Then you could call duplicate token or duplicate token EX to get a copy of that actual token itself. And then you could use either impersonate logged on user or set thread token to apply that token at the thread level. And so I'm sure a lot of people know Malware Unicorn. She helped me kind of build some visualizations of how this actually works. And so here we are, PowerShell.exe is basically opening a process handle to WinLogon here. And then we're going to call duplicate token to duplicate that system token into our PowerShell.exe context. And notice I'm running as like John Doe inside of PowerShell. Then I call set thread token, and I apply that system token to my thread, and then that thread starts running as system, right? And so that's the general idea there. All right, so the next situation would be create a process with a token. And so a reason why an attacker might want to do this is, let's say that your security program locks everything down to where only Internet Explorer or other web browsers are allowed to make like port 80 or port 443 traffic, right? Or communicate with the web proxy. Well, as an attacker, I want to basically make sure that I'm living within one of those browser processes, but they're kind of fickle because a user controls a browser, right? So at any time they could just kill that browser and I'll lose my access. But what I might want to do is create a brand new Internet Explorer process kind of in the background, move into that so that I get by the security feature, but also the user isn't going to just kill this Internet Explorer process that I created. And so I could do pretty much the same thing that I did with the previous attack, except after I duplicate my token, I'm going to use create process with token W to create a brand new process using that token. The caveat here is that token is going to be applied at the process level, not at the thread level like the previous attack. And so we have another kind of demonstration here. So PowerShell.exe opens the process to Explorer.exe. Then it's going to duplicate that domain admin token. And then we're going to create a new process called malicious.exe, whatever you want to call it, and apply that domain admin token to it. So now we have a new process running as domain admin. Next slide. So another really cool attack is this make and impersonate token. So up until now, we've only been able to duplicate or impersonate tokens for users that are currently logged onto the system that we have access to, right? in this case, there may be a situation that you come across credentials kind of in your attacker life cycle or whatever that you want to use, but you don't have that user logged in, so you can't necessarily impersonate that user. Let's say you're like combing through file shares and you find an admin who's left their passwords in a text file somewhere or a batch script. Now I have those credentials. I can use the logon user function and set the DW logon type parameter to logon32 logon new credentials, which is a type 9 logon, and pass those credentials to create a completely new logon session. Has anybody familiar with like run as / net only, like that type of being able to run as a separate user? This is the same functionality that's performing at the API level. And so what this does is it creates a new logon session of type new credentials, which is kind of important. And it's going to create a token that's kind of a dual token. So locally, I'm going to run as the original user that I called logon user as. But on the network, I'm going to be able to authenticate using the credentials that I passed to the logon user function, right? And so if we go ahead and go to the next slide, this will hopefully make more sense. So I'm going to call logon user and pass this domain admin username and password, right? It's going to create a new logon credential session or new credentials logon session with a John Doe local user and a domain admin network user. And then that's going to be applied to my thread. And everything, if you just query the access token, it will appear to be running as John Doe. But then when I make my network connection, I'll be running as domain admin. So it's kind of a little more stealthy than just stealing the token. Next slide. All right, so we've identified some procedures, 3 different procedures, but in my mind, there's one that kind of stands out as being different than the others. And so that create a process with token kind of attack is doing process level token impersonation, right? Instead of that applying the token at the thread level. And because of that, the detection will be slightly different. And so for that reason, we've just decided to put that off kind of as an excluded factor for now. We'll come back to that maybe next week or at some time later. And so we're going to focus on token impersonation or token theft and create an impersonate token going forward in this hypothesis. All right, so our collection requirements. At this point, we want to start determining what type of information do we need, like what do we need to collect in order to determine that this activity has happened in our environment. And so there's a few like open source tools that perform access token manipulation. So one is incognito, that's kind of the old standard, right? And that's built into Meterpreter. Invoke token manipulation is a PowerShell implementation that's built into PowerSploit or PowerShell Empire. And then like a Cobalt Strike is an example of a paid product that has token manipulation capabilities. And so at this point, we want to collect all of our relevant data points. And the first thing that comes to mind is we probably want to collect the access tokens, right, from every process and every thread. And so we'll start there and kind of see what we can do from there. All right, so collecting access tokens, you do your research and you come up with kind of this functionality to collect them, right? And so PowerShell, I'm a PowerShell fanboy. PowerShell does not have a capability natively to collect access tokens. And so we had to go through and actually write our own script. And basically what we do is we iterate through every process and every thread on the machine and call open process or open thread, depending on whether it's a process or thread. That returns a handle to us. Then we could call open process or open thread token, which gives us a handle to the token. And then we could call get token information, which allows us to query, like, who's the user that this token belongs to? What groups does it belong to? What are the privileges? So on and so forth. And we could gain that context about what's happening. Next slide. And so at the end, we end up with a PowerShell script called get access token, which is available on GitHub. And we end up having things like, what is the process context? So this is application frame host. What's the username that this is running as? In this case, just a tester user. The groups are here, like it's a primary token, so on and so forth. And you have all this context about what's happening with that token. So if we go to the next slide. And so when we start to look at impersonation, impersonation's a legitimate thing in the Windows operating system. So we can't just say, oh, if it's using impersonation, then it's bad, we need to kill it. But generally speaking, impersonation is used for very specific reasons. And so that's those reasons would be something like SVC host, which is a service hosting process, right? Which has to host multiple different services, and some of those services may want to run as a different user. And so in that case, SVC host would use impersonation to allow a portion of its basically memory space to be run as a separate user than what it was initially started as. And so at the bottom, we see the primary user. So SVC host was started as system, but it later on impersonates in one of its threads the tester user. And so generally speaking, we see that we're going from the system mandatory level to the medium mandatory level. And in this case, we're going from like a higher privileged user to a lower privileged user, which generally is kind of a safe concept. But when somebody runs git system, this is what this looks like. So the primary username is tester, right? So a lower privileged user. And the impersonated user at the top here is NT authority system. And so this would be a situation where somebody has basically escalated their privilege level based on token impersonation. And so we can kind of identify that, especially when it's running from something like PowerShell.exe, which has there's no reason why PowerShell should be impersonating different users. All right, so at DerbyCon, Robby and I talked about detecting golden ticket attacks. And so one of the things that we kind of stumbled upon is a way to help detect that second situation where an attacker makes a token and then impersonates it. And so one thing that we would want to collect in this case is ticket granting tickets. So Kerberos ticket granting tickets. And so the way that you do this is by querying all the LSA functions. So basically you query the logon sessions, and then every logon session you query and ask, hey, do you have a Kerberos ticket granting ticket? If it does, it returns, and then you can analyze it from there. Next slide. All right, and then you have a script called get Kerberos ticket granting ticket. And generally speaking, you're going to have at the bottom the information about the logon session that ticket belongs to, and you're going to have at the top the information about the ticket itself. Again, in general, when I log on to a system, I'm going to log on as the Jared user account, and then I'm going to request a Kerberos ticket granting ticket for my user account, right? Like generally speaking, I don't log in and then get his Kerberos ticket granting ticket. That just doesn't make sense. And so we kind of compare the logon session user to the actual ticket user itself. So next slide. An example of a benign ticket would be down here we have a logon session for the local admin user in the citadel.covertius.local domain. And at the top we have the client of the ticket is local admin and the domain is citadel.covertius.local. Again, that's what we expect. Next slide. Now this is evidence of kind of that make token attack. So we see the new credentials logon type at the bottom, and we see that the user of the session is just this local user named John, right? But at the top, we see that John requested a ticket for mright_a, which presumably is like an admin account, right, or some sort of domain admin account at citadel.covertius.local. And like that, John has no business having that ticket in his logon session, so we're going to investigate that going forward. All right, so from here, we have kind of an idea of what we want to collect, Kerberos ticket granting tickets and access tokens for processes and threads. And then we want to go forward and identify what the scope of our kind of analysis or collection will be. And so, again, we have 1 week. That's kind of what we're giving ourselves now. You can determine whether that's a sufficient time or maybe too much time. We have 3 domains that we want to gather information from. On those 3 domains, we have one Linux server, which is non-domain joined, and Linux doesn't do authentication in the same way. So we're going to kind of exclude that. We have 9 Windows workstations and 2 Windows servers. We have no sensitive production systems, so we're able to query all 11 of those systems. And so our scope ends up being 3 domains, 11 workstations. Next slide. And then for excluded factors, we're just going to go through that list of tactics, techniques kind of that we came up with during phase 1 of what Empire employs, kind of put those in the side, document that we aren't currently looking at those and maybe we want to revisit them going forward, and then kind of document that we're not looking at that Linux server. And as you're going to see, one of the systems didn't allow us to query information from it because we couldn't escalate to system. It's kind of strange. In order to query access tokens and Kerberos tickets, you have to become system yourself. And so we're impersonating to detect impersonation, which is kind of like a meta thing, I guess. All right, so now we have a demo. We're going to teach you how to be a faceless man, I guess. And so here we go. So I have a PowerShell prompt, and I'm going to establish a PowerShell remoting session with this training lab that we have. So we teach a red team class, which I thought was like a perfect place to look for these types of attacks. And so we're going to establish that session, and we end up having 11 sessions, 11 PowerShell remoting sessions. And maybe this isn't how you want to collect the data, it just is the easiest for me. So you could determine what the best way to collect this data would be for you. All right, so PowerShell has a command called invoke command, which allows you to take a PowerShell remoting session and then execute arbitrary code or arbitrary scripts against those sessions. And so we're going to run this get access token script, and we're going to store that in a $token variable. And so here you see that one system said, hey, you're not able to impersonate NT authority system. And so we're going to get some subset of information from that system. All right. And so we end up with 633 different tokens that we're dealing with, right? And so we got to figure out how we're going to determine where the bad tokens are within that. Again, we're going to do the same thing, but this time we're going to collect Kerberos ticket granting tickets from across those 11 systems. And so we have a get Kerberos ticket granting ticket script that will run against them. And that comes back, same situation with the system token there. And so that one system, we don't have we only have a subset of the tickets and tokens. And so we end up with 76 tickets across 11 systems. All right, so now let's take a look at what a token looks like. I kind of showed this already. We have like the token for the conhost process, just kind of as an example. It's running as this MS SQL FD launcher user. And we see that the primary this is a primary token, so we wouldn't expect that field to be any different. But how can we start whittling down on these 633 different results, right? That's too much information. Imagine if you ran it across thousands of computers, and it's just going to be an egregious amount. And so first things first, we can exclude all primary tokens. By definition, a primary token is not an impersonation token, and thus we're not worried about them in the context of searching for token impersonation. And so PowerShell has this filtering commandlet called whereObject, which allows you to filter out different objects based on some script. So I'm saying where the token type is not token primary. So that reduces it down to 104. So we've reduced by 80 or 85% or so. And so now let's see what else we could do. So now I want to look where the user account for the primary token is not the same as the user account for the impersonation token, right? And so there are situations to where impersonation is used to impersonate the same user account because you want to either add or remove privileges from that user. But in this case, we go down to 49. So now we could maybe we could deal with that a little bit better. Sorry for my slow typing here, but it is what it is, I guess. And so again, we're going to query the same exact thing, but this time I want to see the actual context of those 49 results. And so again, looking for non-primary tokens where primary username and username do not match. And then we're going to look at what process do these tokens belong to? What is the process ID? What is the primary user account? So was that process spawned as? And then what is the username? So who is it impersonating? And then we'll look at the computer that it's associated with. And if you notice, and of course this is a lab, so your mileage may vary a little bit. Every single process is going to be SVC host, which is kind of what we expect. That does not mean that because it's SVC host, it's good. It just means that if it's not SVC host in this case, we might be interested in it. And what we notice is that there's basically every system kind of has one process that's impersonating what looks like a DA. So it's going from system to domain admin. So we might want to investigate that. And so kind of check it out. We're going to go ahead and look at this particular process here. So it's on 10.1.30.152, and it's process ID 920. And so PowerShell remoting is awesome, in my opinion, because it allows you to get kind of like a remote shell on a system. And so what we're going to do is query, use enter PS session to enter a PowerShell, get a PowerShell shell on that 152 system. And so you'll notice that the prompt is going to change to indicate that we are now running on a remote system. And then we could query, I'm going to just, SVC host is a hosting process which has a lot of services that belong to it. And so let's kind of check out what services there are. So we see like IKE extension.exe or something like that, IP help service, landman server. Those are the types of things that are running within that particular SVC host. And that may help us identify, if we do some research on those, why it's using the domain admin account. But because we see that this is kind of a uniform pattern across all of our systems, maybe we want to go see and go check and make sure that actual like kind of activity is really normal across all the systems and not coincidental. And so, again, we're going to do the same thing, but on a separate system. And we're going to enter PS session again on session ID 24. And just verify that that's kind of normal activity. In real life, outside of a 9-minute demo, you would go and like actually look up what those services are and make sure that type of impersonation is something that you would expect, right? That's kind of the general idea. So here, we're seeing 780. We see that it's the same exact SVC host hosting the same exact services. And so maybe this is something that's normal in our environment. And so we kind of leave the access token from the perspective of, all of these processes on every single system look like they're kind of doing the same thing. You would want to do a little bit more checking, but generally speaking, I think it's relatively safe to say that there is no malicious access token impersonation occurring here. So let's look for the other attack technique that we're interested in. All right, so let's query those Kerberos tickets that we collected. Remember, I think there's like 76 of them. And so we can start to look at those and see if there's any evidence of that make and impersonate kind of attack, right? So make token and impersonate. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start whittling down on those 76 tickets by looking for anything where the session username does not equal the client name, right? And again, I said this was a training lab from a red team class that we taught, and so this is going to come back and have a ton of results that are evidence of malicious stuff, not necessarily specifically what we're looking for. And so we whittled down from 76 to 26, and now we're going to look at the actual context here. And we're going to look at, I think the session ID or the session logon ID, the username of the, who logged in on the session, and then some information about the ticket itself. And of course, the computer that ticket is on, so we can investigate further. And so I think in going through this, every single one of these happen to be malicious kind of in their own right. The ones that we're kind of focusing on are the ones at the top, the A. Robbins DA to Matt Nelson DA. But for instance, we see that John user kind of becoming Mike Wright there, which is pretty suspicious. We see John user becoming SQL service, which that's extremely strange in my opinion. But here we're seeing like an Andy Robbins DA or A. Robbins DA becoming an M. Nelson DA account and maybe doing something strange there. And so let's go check that out. One of our colleagues, Lee Christensen, wrote a script that allows you to query a list of processes based on the logon session. So given a logon session ID, you're able to say what processes belong to this logon session. And so we could go in and start kind of querying specific processes within a logon session to determine what the context of that logon session is. And that helps us determine whether something malicious is happening. And so here I've run that, I've made sure that that script is available within my PowerShell remoting session, and now we're going to go ahead and enter that session and try to investigate some of these kind of weird Kerberos tickets. All right, and our prompt is going to change to indicate we're on that remote system, and now I could do get logon session processes, pass it a logon session ID. This is some pretty old activity, so not all of these are going to have processes associated with them. They're kind of like dangling logon sessions, and so we'll kind of work through them iteratively until we find something that's interesting for us. All right, so the first one came back with there's no processes associated with that logon session. Second one, same thing. But the third one, I think, is where we kind of strike gold. And anybody that has used PowerShell Empire might recognize this. This is PowerShell with an encoded command, and this is like a base 64 blob of like code, so it could be shell code, it could be anything. And generally speaking, this is bad, right? And so you could go back and you can actually like decode that blob. You could do it in PowerShell. You could go online to find some base 64 decoder, whatever you fancy, and you could figure out what's going on there. Turns out that ended up being a Meterpreter payload, and so remember, we were initially focused on PowerShell Empire, and we eventually came back to finding Meterpreter, which is a different implementation of kind of the same attack. So that, in my mind, kind of justifies this process a little bit. All right, so at this point, we've unmasked the masked man, I guess, if you know the context of that picture, after they killed everybody. But that's pretty much our presentation. We're happy to take questions at this point, if anybody has anything for us. So thank you for coming out, definitely.
Thank you.
And if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and they have a microphone that they're going to bring around. And please keep your question until you get the microphone.
All right.
Yep. Easy.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.